Okay, let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to Operative's webinar on increasing RFP response rates. My name is Don Ambler and I'm joined by Travis Howe, and we'll go through some more detailed introductions in just a few minutes. A few housekeeping items first before we get into the webinar itself. Each of you who are listening in the audience are in listen-only mode. That means that we won't be able to hear you, you're on mute, but you will be able to submit questions to us through a questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Using GoToMeeting, you'll be able to type questions to our team here in New York, and that team will then send those questions on to me so that we can discuss them later on in the meeting between Travis and I and give you some answers. Also, we're going to record this webinar, so everything is going to be posted onto the Operative website in the next 2 days so that you're able to come back, listen to the webinar again, as well as send it on to friends and colleagues that weren't able to join for today's session. So with that, let me talk through the agenda, what we're planning for the next half hour, or hour rather. The format will be basically a discussion between Travis and I where we talk about the challenges of managing revenue operations, as well as getting into the details of how RFP efficiencies can be gained within our industry. We'll make some introductions to begin with, talk about Operative, who we are, frame up the challenge, and then at the end, probably the last 10, 15 minutes of the webinar, we'll take, again, your questions so we can respond to those directly. So with that, my name is Don Ambler. I'm the Managing Director for European Operations with Operative. So I oversee all revenue, service, delivery for the company in the UK and Scandinavian markets. And Travis, welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Travis Howe, the Senior Vice President for Planning and Ad Operations for Sony in North and South America. And we represent my division that I represent oversees the planning and ad operations that goes into the majority of the entertainment sites that Sony represents, whether they are television extension sites, owned and operated independent sites, or sites that exist with some of our diversified platforms, most notably our console business, PlayStation.
Great, thanks for that, Travis. And we'll come back to you in just a few minutes. Let me walk through a little bit of introduction to Operative and then frame up the discussion for today, and then we'll get right into the details. So a little background on Operative. We are a company that's been in the industry for about 12 years, helping media owners with solutions for managing the advertising business, ranging from trafficking, campaign management, and optimization, all the way through to software platforms to help our conversation today, really from pre-sales, inventory management, traffic automation, and financial automation reporting. We have about 250 employees now. We've grown to be a global company that spans North America, South America, Asia, Australia, and Europe. And our customers are also industry leaders, right? So we have about 200 media companies that use our solutions globally, and that represents approximately $6 billion in total ad spend that run through all of our solutions. So to frame up the discussion for today, we really see a publisher as the core user of our products, and we work with a lot of various types of publishers, right, from US-based publishers that work on different models of delivering advertising revenue, and of course global publishers that have sort of a shared service model. In essence, though, we see 4 constituents at each publisher. So a product group that puts together the ad products and manages the ad products and pricing and yield of a sales team that looks after the selling of the products, the planning, the ad operations groups that do the actual trafficking and campaign management, and the finance groups. So those constituents are all essentially sharing information back and forth. So in a silo, it's not so much of a challenge to manage data that is stored within sales, for instance, a planner that's building out a response to an RFP, but it becomes very complicated when sales then has to react to information that says that may come from ad operations, right? That may come from a planning group, and try to compile all of that and send it back out for a response to a media brief or an RFP from an advertiser or an agency. And then that gets even more complex as we start to layer on the actual delivery and execution of those campaigns, and then the changes that occur along the way. So to frame up the problem, we think that the RFP is really the central entrance, if you will, sort of the front door into the challenge that faces a publisher, because it's the intersection of all of these pieces of business and technology nuance that need to come together to effectively represent what a publisher is able to sell in the marketplace. So that's really the reality check there, is that there's a lot of information that's stored on multiple desktops. Occasionally, right, we see very duplicative processes throughout the industry where folks are heavily reliant on Excel, and that leads to control challenges, right, where you have different methodologies depending on the sales team, the sales operations group, and those are not always consistent, which leads to errors potentially, and departments not operating cross-functionally in the most efficient manner possible. The impact of all of this, of course, is the ability to scale, right? It becomes very difficult to grow an ad business without a common framework and a way of managing information across departments, across constituents, as well as with the actual buyer. So with that framing in mind, we would think of the solution as an enterprise business platform, right? So this certainly has been solved in other industries where, say, manufacturing or automotive, you're able to bring together all of the groups that service that market, the people, the processes, the technologies, into one centralized system. And what Operative offers is the ability to essentially do that same type of operation for ad management for our industry. Okay, so with that in mind, Travis, how would we start to discuss Sony's ability to manage revenue operations, and how you came to begin working with Operative to help streamline the efficiencies?
Well, I think it's probably a good starting point is to take us back to why we made the decision to become a more automated workflow organization. And that journey for us started approximately 2.5 years ago, when we really just started to gain scale, but more importantly, what our business environment was, as I had mentioned up front, is we represent a variety of different properties that all have their own partners. And when we started to look at our ability to scale and scale quickly, we recognized pretty early on that some of the manual processes that we were doing that served us well certainly weren't going to satisfy our ability to scale and more importantly, scale quickly. And when we first started looking at the life cycle of our ad sales process, the RFP process was one of the areas that we really wanted to hone in on, recognizing that we already had our ad servers in place and they were providing us significant abilities to scale and some reporting. What we didn't have a whole lot of visibility into is how we were creating and architecting RFPs and doing it quickly, and then how were we reporting on some of the nuances of that work effort. As noted in one of your previous slides, things like inventory, pipeline management, revenue forecasting. So what we ended up doing was looking across the marketplace and identifying that bringing on a workflow tool that could really help the front end was going to be most successful for us. And looking at the usual suspects in the space, our identification of Operative was strongly based off of two core functions. One, deep integration with our ad server, which was most critical for us to be able to manage the handoff between our to preserve the technology infrastructure that we had really architected on the ad serving side, and making sure that we didn't break that process. But then in addition to that, looking at a tool that would really allow us better insight into managing our diversified product set, being able to more quickly manage packaging, forecasting, and pricing, that allowed us to not only drive scale, but also drive some consistency. Like a lot of ad sales organizations, we've got offices across the US. Now currently we've got offices in Latin America countries as well. So being able to create a very consistent approach to how we were responding to deals was really important in our scorecard process or evaluation process operative was certainly the best fit for us.
Got it. That's great. So really it was consistency around driving process across the multiple brands, the media houses, integrations with the ad server, and that was particularly around efficiency and automation with the ad server to support a very diversified product set.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of our biggest mantras was just how are we going to gain scale, right? We, manual processes are only as good as, our ability to keep them up, and we knew that if we were going to grow multiple regions and multiple countries, being able to bring in a system that would allow us to get scale and, as a byproduct of that, eliminate a significant amount of our manual processes and data entry error potential was going to be a critical success factor for us.
Got it. So talking about scale and maybe honing in on the RFP process, how did Sony respond to agencies sending through a media brief or an RFP before they started using Operative?
So we responded to it in a way that I think a lot of organizations probably do, which is, Excel and PowerPoint. And, both of those tools, serve lots of organizations really well, and they serviced us really well, but we leveraged those to specifically respond to the RFP using the PowerPoint, obviously, to create our proposals, and using Excel in order for us to present back to the agency our media schedule. Now, granted, that sort of on the surface sounds easy or easy enough to do, but obviously the challenge with any of that is, so what do you put on that media schedule?
Right.
And that's where issues of being able to provide real-time forecasting, being able to manage rate card, being able to manage products became incredibly more difficult to do across multiple offices, multiple properties when you're talking about managing hundreds of different products or package sets. It becomes almost insurmountable to any one individual to be able to commit that to memory. And so that was a challenge for us as well. So, certainly those tools served us well, but as we began to grow, the nuances of being able to leverage our ad server for some of that information became unrealistic, and then certainly being able to drive any level of consistency and insight for the individual planners also became a significant challenge.
Right. Okay. Very interesting. So as you start to grow and scale up the business, how did that affect productization, right? So I get the idea that there are a lot of products that, of course, a salesperson can't keep in their head or a planner can't keep in their head, and that they're either relying on the ad server or they're relying on a system. Where did you kind of start with the productization, and then where did you end up with as you start to systematize the process and the products themselves? Was it a decrease in the product catalog, or was it actually an increase but a more nuanced approach to packaging the products up for an RFP?
I think if you ask anyone on my team, the whole work effort that was involved in really understanding our product category was best described as a labor of love, and at times somewhat painful labor of love, but an absolute necessary activity for us to get our solution right. And so I think it required us to really ask, quite frankly, a very simple question, which is, what can we sell and what do we want to sell? Which can be two very different questions, two very different answers, right? So we started with the whole idea of looking at every possible thing that we can sell in every property, whether it's our television extension sites or our independent owned and operated sites or PlayStation, for example. We had to make a very detailed catalog, if you will, of every single unit, every single location, and every individual unique sponsorship type element that we could sell. Then we did sort of galvanize a really collaborative process with the sales team to get a better understanding of, just because we can sell it, we need to ask ourselves, should we be selling it? And so then that allowed us to really look at our products under a different lens and allowed us to become much more refined in terms of what products we're going to make it to the end state. And then the third process step that we went through is then identifying, once we understand what our foundational level of ad products that we want to sell are there unique and interesting ways that we can package them together? So again, for us, using the mantra of scale, we wanted to identify easy ways to say things like, when we all say homepage takeover for a particular site, is there a standard way in which we can define that? Is it a marquee, a 300 by 250, a leaderboard? Does it come with pre-roll? Does it not come with pre-roll? So then that last exercise was to look at all of that inventory and begin to create product groupings, or what we would call packaging, which again really helped us with scale, because there's a big difference for us on saying, in order to create a homepage takeover, I have to now go select 4 or 5 different products, of which I might forget, or can I just select one product grouping and all of it self-populates? So when we talk about scale, speed, and efficiency, that was really valuable for us. So those are really the 3 hurdles we looked at: everything we could sell, everything that we want to sell, and then how do we package it up uniquely. And I think one of the areas that we were very successful with is really bringing sales into the fold of that conversation. So not looking at it from a very stagnant inventory perspective, but really making it a collaborative process. And when I think about our entire work effort, if you will, in sort of deploying the tool and deploying it well, that is something I think we really got right, because we certainly made sure that we invested a significant amount of time into having those kinds of conversations.
Right, and did you find that it was most useful to bring sales in at a very early standpoint, once you'd sort of had a foundational product list, and then start to build up then the nuance of the packaging in collaboration with sales? Or was it more of, we've put together what we think will be the right package list, and then let's bring sales in and get confirmation?
We really brought them in the second step. I think it was important for us to sort of evaluate everything we could sell. And the reason why it was important for our planning team and our ad operations team to really do that in a cross-functional group was that there was a lot of elements that sales might not have been selling at all. So we didn't want to miss sort of that really low level of detail. Once we felt that we had the really defined catalog of products, that's when we wanted to bring in sales for them to actually react to that product list.
Right.
And then once we fine-tuned that, we were really in a good position to then identify the more commoditized packages that were really going to help us gain efficiency. But the reality is that when you look at this kind of exercise, it's definitely not a set it and forget it, right? For us, it's a continual dialogue. It's an iterative process of, constantly asking ourselves, what are we selling? What are we selling more of? Are there new packages that we haven't created package groups for within our system? So for us, it's a consistent and constant circular conversation that we've got to have. But to your question, I think that we really brought sales in once we felt like we had a really good picture for them to react to.
Right. And then how do you sort of translate that into making sure that those packages and the productization exercise that you've gone through and the collaboration with sales sort of makes pen to paper, right? So that when an offer is going out to a buyer, that all of that work and the packaging is actually making it onto the I/O in a way that optimizes yield for you, as well as passing through the right controls along the way.
That's where I would define it is, that's where the art breaks out from the science, right? Because I think that for us, in order to drive scale, you've got to be adherent to a lot of linear processes, and we have a significant amount of processes and policies that are in place, particularly on the planning side, that allows us to make sure we're sticking within our boundaries. But there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's always going to be clients that want something a little bit different or a little more custom. So for us, it is, as hard as we try to adhere to the policies, we've got to make sure that we're also pivoting and are flexible enough to accommodate the needs of our agencies. One way in which we help manage or keep that process oiled is to consistently revisit the packages. And so we can ask ourselves things like, is every time we're putting a homepage takeover on the plan, if every time we're doing that, we're also adding in a newsletter or also adding in a different inventory type, then that might require us to actually change the definition of what we're calling a homepage takeover as a package with an operative. So it does require us to consistently evaluate the RFPs that we're doing and working very closely with ad ops to evaluate the deals that we are actually closing and making sure that those two things are synced up.
Got it.
So in my opinion, it's not a, I don't know if there's any one perfect way in order to do that. If in fact you want to be a flexible organization that can pivot, but I think that the key for us in this entire process is the very close relationship our sales development and planning team have with our ad operations team. It's having the closeness of those two organizations effectively communicating with each other that I think has been a key success factor for us.
Right. And do you have a challenge of sort of managing a different selling motion between your properties, or do you work on a model where that isn't such of a challenge during the process of pre-sales?
Talk to me a little bit about selling motion, meaning just being able to toggle between multiple properties.
Right, so the idea of being able to, for instance, sell one site differently than another site, and the process of going through and maybe receiving editorial approval, right? Or creating a big idea from one site and then translating that across to others. I think that's really a scale challenge that a lot of publishers come across. And is it a challenge that you've also seen and sort of pivoting to be able to deliver that sort of custom solution throughout the different catalog of properties that you offer?
Yeah, I think for us it's a bit of a blessing and a curse to some degree, because I think that with the properties that we represent, it does allow us to sort of respond to the sky's the limit. We can do a lot of things for a lot of different people on a lot of different platforms and touch lots of different customer segments. So for us, it's a beautiful thing that allows us to respond well to agency needs. On the flip side, it's a lot of information for us to manage internally. And so, speaking specifically of the sales development function of our planners, there is no shortage of things that we can do. There is no shortage of editorial support we can get from the product teams that represent these sites. I think our challenge is just consistently keeping in mind what can we do and just committing that to memory, and that can be daunting. I mean, I think the level of diversity across all of our different sites, no two sites are the same, and
right.
Each have seemingly an exponential amount of products, and I think that bringing it back to Operative, that's where we have been really lucky. Bringing in Operative allows us to have a consistent repository that we can go to remind ourselves of what we can do and what we can't do by individual site. That I think it would be a challenge to any organization that is working through manual processes. So it allows sales development and planners a tool at their fingertips, if you will, to go back and say, all right, remind me again, for this TV extension site, what are all the different things we can do, from banners to newsletters to sponsorships to homepage takeovers, and then allows us very quickly to pivot to a property like PlayStation, for example, that has a completely different offering to an agency, and allow us to remember all the different things we can do in that capacity as well. It allows us to scale quicker. It allows us to operate in more of a shared service function. So I think to your specific question, Operative has proven to be very useful when it comes to being able to manage a very diverse set of properties.
Great, that's great. Thanks for that. And at Sony, who uses Operative, and how do they communicate with other folks that may use Operative less frequently or not even use Operative at all?
I would say when you look at the life cycle of Operative, everyone in our organization touches it in some form or capacity, whether it's sales development, whether it's sales, whether it's ad operations, whether it's our pricing and yield management function. Everyone has a defined role of how they use Operative to pull information out of it. Our heavy users certainly are within our sales development organization in terms of RFP generation. That certainly is the heaviest amount of work, but that's not to say that the ad operations team doesn't use it extensively as well. They do, in terms of when deals close and being able to push individual line items for deals into our individual ad servers. So if I was to priority rank who uses it most, certainly it's sales development, but I would say ad operations certainly sits right below that in terms of our heavier users.
Right. And you also mentioned the pricing and yield management group. Do they look after inventory as well and use Operative to manage the yield curve?
They do. Certainly yield management, pricing and yield management is something that we're in the process of really developing and defining for what it means for us at Sony. So, in our initial stages of the development of that group, certainly Operative is playing a role in terms of how we're forecasting, how we're looking at deal deliveries, what we would describe as looking at our overall portfolio set and being able to manage our portfolio set. As we continue to move forward, I think that that's going to be an evolving process for us in terms of how we not only leverage Operative but our ad servers in that capacity as well. So unlike some of our other processes that are much more mature as it relates to Operative, we're sort of in our young stage, if you will, in terms of understanding what Operative will mean for us. But currently we are leveraging it to a large degree to help us get better insight into our forecasting, and then allowing ourselves to roll that up to the macro portfolio level in terms of generating deals.
Great, okay. And just on the mechanics of sort of generating a deal itself, how do you today manage the passing over, the back and forth, the versioning of an insertion order or a media program with a buyer?
Well, I mean, I think any planner will appreciate the fact that an individual media schedule can have one revision or 1,000 revisions, and so and no one deal is the same. So and that's the classic example of just being able to provide good customer service. I think for us, what we do is at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that Operative is always the system of record for a deal. And so, as I had mentioned similarly, we all want to live by a process. We always need to make sure that we're flexible enough to accommodate it outside of that. In a lot of instances, we have to make revisions to the agency template. So, one of the challenges that we are overcoming is figuring out how Operative is able to be nimble enough to support unique media schedule templates that agencies have. Because at the end of the day, if the vehicle to supply media schedule to an agency is in their unique format with macros and calculations, et cetera, a lot of our revisions have to be made in that template. For agencies that don't have their own media template, we're able to leverage Operative much easier. But the commonality between both of those processes at the end of the day is that the deal that's in Operative, whether it's midstream, but more importantly at the end, has to reflect the overall deal that closed via the IO. So whether or not that's happening real time or whether or not that's happening at the end, the strength, it's one of those garbage in, garbage out, right? So the strength of our system has to be with making sure that the data we put in is as accurate as it possibly can be, and making sure that then that helps operationalize how we hand that off to our ad operations group. So I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but it sort of is a case-by-case basis depending on the needs of the individual agency.
Well, I think you did. I mean, there were really two parts to that, or two thoughts behind that. One is that challenge of manipulating and sort of massaging data that comes out of the process of getting a response back to an agency to set up the media program and the buy, right, and the uniqueness of each different agency and the requirements around the templates that are used. And that's very, difficult to sort of program against, and that's why, over the years we've had, for instance, the IAB e-business exchange, right, trying to set standards to do that more efficiently. I think those will eventually come to gestation, but in the meantime, we sort of have to live in the world of Excel, right? And then the other side of that is just the scaling, right? So the ability to capture all of the data around the order, how it was flighted, right, which products were chosen, and have one central repository for that, not only for pre-sales, right, but we often hear that that's a real challenge for after the insertion order is actually signed, having to manage changes after it's been executed. Do you also do that within Operative?
We do, and I think that that's where, one of the common things that you'll hear us talk a lot about is that's where the relationship between our ad operations team and our sales development team becomes absolutely crucial. Ensuring that we've got processes in place that allows for seamless and quick communication between both groups. If during the course of a campaign a change is happening at the deal level, whether or not we are, you know, as an example, re-expressing inventory or adding something to a deal or making a change midstream, for us, we always ensure that ad operations is then communicating that back to our sales development team and making sure that they are going in and updating that deal in operative. So as new line items are being pushed from operative into our ad servers or not, and we're just making sure that we are making operative our standard system of record at the individual deal level. That's important. But again, you know, the system's only going to be as great as the communication that facilitates this. And I think my advice to anyone who's looked at our processes and says, what's one of the ways in which you all have been successful? It is that almost unified approach that we take from sales development and ad ops, sort of functioning, you know, hypothetically as one team.
Right, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about that process. Where does it really begin when you start to put together a buy? Does the sales development team actually ping back and forth with ad ops as they put together the proposal, or is that sort of latter when you get into the closing stage of the deal that the ad ops team starts to work more closely with sales development?
It does happen somewhat collaboratively throughout the process, but at least in the world that we function in, you know, the sales development team certainly has their own discrete functions, responsibilities, and accountabilities, and the ad operations team has their own set of accountabilities and responsibilities. Where there is overlap or communication is certainly in the deal level, in the RFP level. At any time where the sales development team is proposing something that may be off-grid, maybe a new idea, may not be quite as we have defined it within our product category, they always reach out to ad ops to get approval or insight into that idea or into that placement to make sure that we're proposing something what we can actually do. So there, in that step in the process, there's quite a bit of collaboration in terms of validating, confirming, and approving things that are new, unique, seasonal before we ever publish an official media schedule. Where that collaboration happens at the end as well is, you know, then that happens when the deal actually closes. There is also communication between ad ops back to sales development to ensure that there's transparency in terms of what's on the media schedule and what's the intent, right? So understanding what the backstory is behind the deal, and I'm talking certainly much more complex deals, right? If it's straight inventory, it's, you know, it's self-explanatory, but when we're talking sponsorships, editorial, custom integrations, there, you know, no system is going to be able to replace that conversation. Where we leverage operative is the vehicle to have that conversation. So both groups can access the same system of record, access the same deal, the same insertion order, and talk to that deal and make sure that there's a seamless handoff between what was proposed and what was closed. So as the ad ops team goes off and does the implementation there, they've got their marching orders. So I would say that the communication between both groups happens sort of in two specific areas of the life cycle.
That's great. And so from that sort of overlapping responsibility and work on a campaign, how does the handoff occur when a campaign is actually confirmed and then the assets are gathered and sent off to the trafficking team to execute?
Well, all of that, you know, and I'm not sure if this is similar or dissimilar to larger organizations that are established with us, but once the deal closes, the entire deal is then transitioned to our ad ops team. So we've got, you know, we are organized in such a way that the ad operations organization is solely accountable for picking up that insertion order and running with it. So the person that we have running our ad operations team is a master at project management, and so we have created an organization that just allows that operations team to run from communicating with the client, collecting the assets, pushing light items into our individual ad server. So there is somewhat of a separation of church and state between our sales development group and our ad operations group.
Got it.
Whereas other organizations out there have account managers or people who sort of sit in the middle of that process were not organized in such a capacity.
So there really isn't a broker of information between the two groups. It's that there's a complete pass-off from pre-sales into the actual execution of the campaign.
Correct.
Got it. Interesting. So have you been able to measure, or do you have a sense of whether or not you've been able to respond to more RFPs now that you've implemented and used the operative system compared to before it was implemented?
In terms of core metrics, or just an overall
just a
ROI?
sense, really, of, yeah, have you seen an increase, an uptick of the number of RFPs, or even the efficiency of responding to the RFP in terms of time from when you first received the RFP, so the first touch, into turning it back around?
Yes. I mean, I think for us, one of the greatest ROI elements that we looked at in terms of implementing the system, I think, is our ability to respond to more RFPs. So certainly that has to do with time, but at any individual deal that we work on in the RFP process, it may take a little time or a lot of time depending on how much needs to be invested in architecting the idea. Where Operative has really been able to drive economies of scale for us is the ability to, once those ideas are architected, turn out the media schedule much faster, using Operative in order to better manage our product catalog, allowing us to respond to a range of different RFPs across properties in a way that makes it much more efficient for us. You know, we have done studies that looks at the number of RFPs that we used to respond to prior to Operative and the number of RFPs that we are responding to now. We've had to extrapolate out of that study just the overall growth in the business, but it has been unequivocally clear to us that having this system in place has allowed us not only just to respond to RFPs at a greater volume, but be able to manage that entire process, whether it's our pipeline, looking at revenue recognition or potential revenue. This system not only has allowed us to respond to a greater volume, but gives us much greater insight into what is that volume, how is it closing, how are those deals evolving, which I think is a critical success factor. I think when we talk to a lot of our colleagues, there is a focus on just pure volume, but I think for us, or what I would counsel any organization on, is not only volume, but just getting a better insight to what that volume is, what property it's on, what do your pricing metrics look like, what is your close rate, what is your pipeline, which is something that we could have never been able to done in a manual environment or without armies of people, which, you know, would be nice, but we certainly don't have. So.
Sure. That's great. And on that note, maybe it makes sense to transition to some of the questions that the audience has started to send in. Let me just go ahead and open up my email here. We've got a couple of questions on yield management. One, I think, was just if we could talk more about how you boosted yield and ECPM through rethinking the way that you productized inventory. Sort of a very general, kind of broad question on how yield could be managed, but is there a measurement that you look at that maybe uses ECPM as the currency for productizing inventory and packaging it up together?
There's a couple ways I guess I could tackle that. I think the at least for us, the concept of ECPM sort of takes a variety of different forms. I mean, in the most simplest form, it's, you know, what's the ECPM once you add in all the inventory and the added value at the deal level. We can look at ECPM as it relates to the package level, meaning if you look at all the different inventory types that make up a homepage takeover as a based off of delivery, or are we giving them a more optimized ECPM because it's at the package level, not the individual unit level? And then there's a third way that we can look at it in our analysis, is that, you know, when all is said and done and you look at all of your deals that have closed, what kind of eCPM are you generating at the closed deal level? So sort of three facets that we can look at it for yield management. And it does sound somewhat laborious, but interesting, in our studies, we have seen sort of a range of different outputs coming from that. I guess in our experience with yield management, and again, I would classify us as being somewhat young in this environment in terms of really architecting our solution that works best for our business. But I would say that, are we putting together proposals that meet the flighting, targeting, the budget, and the ideation of that individual RFP in such a way that we are delivering our best foot forward to the client? And then certainly from a sales development perspective, one of the biggest things that we track is close rate. And I think that some people might find that odd on the sales development side, since the account executives should be concerned about close rate. But on the sales development side, we're also aware of it too, because it gives us insight into, say, let's say for an example, a particular planner's sales close rate is low. That is an indicator to us that, are we not responding to the advertisers in a way that they want to be responded to? Are we not offering the right product? Are there breakdowns in communication? It is an indicator to us of areas that we can look at in our process to show increased performance. And certainly the fourth big thing that we look at is, we certainly look at all the data analytics around pricing and sell-through rates. But again, for us, within my role, I'm looking at it more on the sales development side, so I couldn't speak specifically to how that's being monitored on the sales side. But the reality is there's not a whole lot of difference, right? Because we see the sales development or the planners to be a part of the sales team. We see them as a cohesive unit. So we deploy very somewhat similar metrics to what you would do in a traditional sales side to make sure we're balancing out both sides of the equation, so we're firing on all cylinders. So I don't know if that specifically addresses the question that I can't necessarily on the sales side, but I think my message to a lot of organizations are, some of the traditional metrics that you would use on the sales side, we actually deploy on the sales development side to keep it balanced, to keep the work effort effective. And for us, a lot of those metrics we can pull straight out of Operative in order to make it turnkey and efficient.
That's great. That's great. Makes a lot of sense. I think answers the query. We've also had a few other questions come in. One was, are media plans input directly, and this is a process question really, are media plans input directly into Operative One at the pre-sale level, or are they put into the system after the plan has been approved by the client or the agency?
We do it during the pre-sales process. So our process that we deploy is that the media schedule is created in Operative before being submitted to the account executive for submission to the agency. Where we have to be flexible in that process is when we need to respond to an RFP with an agency template. Since that currently isn't a seamless process with an Operative, what we do is have a flexible system that in the instance where there's an agency template that needs to be submitted, often the planner will build that agency template first, have the account executive submit that. After submission, the planner will go in, or sometimes, almost simultaneously, also develop it within Operative. It is somewhat double work because you're creating a media schedule for the agency in their template, and you're creating it in Operative. And certainly we're looking at ways in which that process can be better streamlined. But to answer the question directly, we do it all during the pre-sales process. Now, often, once that IO closes, we have to go back and make sure that the insertion order matches what we have in Operative. And in a lot of instances it does, because we've kept up with that process during the negotiation process, but it's a really nice checks and balances at the end of the day. And the reason why we do that is that it also allows us to manage our pipeline, which is critical to our business as well. Keeping all of the working proposals within Operative allows us to manage our pipeline and forecast our revenue.
great. We also had a question on adoption of systems over time. The general thrust of the question is, how do you ensure that you're getting the most value from Operative as you continue to use it, right? You sort of talked about the iterative product process. Is there also an iterative process around adopting a system, making sure that it's being fully utilized?
I think that's a great question, one that we are asking ourselves right now. I think for us, I mean, it's certainly adoption of a system for us always starts at the top. So for us, the individual that runs our sales development group and our individual who runs that operations are believers in technology, incredible stewards of Operative, and really have helped not only endorse it, but help enforce its rollout. So for us, it always starts in adoption always starts in the top, the highest levels of leadership. And I'm really lucky in that capacity for the two leaders that I have that are the stewards of Operative. I think another critical element of system adoption is constantly evaluating the effectiveness of the tool. I think that a lot of organizations, of having us implemented lots of technology over the course of our ad sales group, it's very easy to implement a system and then set it and forget it. And it's really easy to go back to old behaviors, readopt manual processes, blame a system for all the problems in the world. And that's just human behavior. And I think for us, how we try to curb that is that on a regular basis, we have consistent dialogue with our account manager at Operative. In fact, we do bi-weekly and weekly calls to constantly ensure that we are tracking our enhancement list, that we are on top of helping Operative evolve the tool where we need to drive our business. And then more on an annual level, which is an exercise we're currently going now, we evaluate our entire life cycle, specifically as it relates to how we use the system, and ask ourselves some very tough questions around, are we using the system the way it's intended? Are we using the system based off of what we as an organization committed to? And have we thought about where we need the tool to go next in order to support the next year of our business? And we're going through that process now, and it really helps us curb bad behaviors. It really helps us dust off what we do and why we do it, and it really helps us not become complacent with the system, which is very easy to do. If you implement an ad server or Salesforce or any other tool out there, it's very easy to do, and I think the only way you curb that is being conscious of it and being committed to reevaluating your processes on a regular basis.
That's great. And on that note, we're coming up to the top of the hour. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about your experiences, shed some insight on the sales development and traffic processes at Sony. And again, thanks for answering our questions from the audience.
Not a problem. My pleasure.
As we wrap up, also thank you to the audience for sending in all of your questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to quite all of them before our time ran out. But if you'd like to learn more about Operative, talk with us about the solution and how we could help your media company, we'd be happy to do that. My details are on the screen now, and certainly you can also visit our website at operative.com. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and speak with you soon.